welcome to episode 20 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. Today, myself and Zach have a few questions lined up for you guys to answer. We're going to be answering a question on different ways to program hypertrophy work based on your preferences. We're going to talk about some of our thoughts related to how to approach self-programming. And then we're going to finally answer a question related to kind of like singles year round and how that aligns with some of the principles of specificity. Before we get to that, I do want to quickly plug our email list. We are going to be putting out some articles in the coming months. And in order to make sure that you are the first to hear about that, definitely go ahead and sign up to our email list. If you just go to data-drivenstrength.com, scroll down to the bottom, you can pop your email address in there to make sure you're the first to know about that. We're also plugging away in the background on some big updates to our individualized programming product. So briefly, it's just a subscription service that includes some access to us in a private Facebook group, as well as a ton of different combinations of training cycles. So kind of like a lower cost, programming guidance option. But anyway, we're working on some big improvements to that. So in order to be the first to hear about that as well, definitely sign up for the newsletter. All right, without further ado, we'll go ahead and dive into question one. The first question is from Malik. He asks, how would you program for someone who dreads hypertrophy work? By this, I mean things like hack squats or leg press with controlled eccentrics in that 8 to 12 rep range and pretty close to failure. So with a low RAR. He proposed clusters as a potential option and wanted to know our thoughts on programming for hypertrophy work if you're not a fan of the traditional structure.
Yeah, so I think the first thing that comes to mind for me on this is kind of the reason that you don't like hypertrophy work. I think there's kind of two ways you can dislike it. In my experience here, the first um, would just be the general discomfort that comes with high repetition work that's closer to failure, especially with longer repetition durations with like controlled eccentrics and all that. Just the general discomfort that's associated with that, and I think that's where probably the pretty standard answer that we give a lot of the time here is where a lot of those low fatigue strategies will probably apply. So if you're using heavier weights, probably greater than 75% of 1RM. Doesn't seem that you need to be super close to failure to maximize hypertrophy, at least on the muscles that we generally measure and research. There's definitely some limitations to that in terms of, all areas of the muscle or, synergistic muscles like the triceps and the bench press or the glutes and the squat. We're not totally sure how proximity to failure impacts those kind of areas, but in general, the kind of the prime movers like the quads and the squat and the pecs and the bench press, for the most part, as long as the load's heavy enough and you're training with kind of maximal concentric intent, you can probably stay pretty far from failure and do that on the competition list or close variants if that's the way that you prefer to get most of your training volume in. And that's probably the main key, is so long as your training volume is kind of equated. That's not going to be super straightforward to do that, but if we could theoretically equate it perfectly, I would be pretty confident in saying then hypertrophy is going to be pretty similar. The second way that I think you can be kind of not enjoying hypertrophy training are for some people that are really, really kind of progress oriented. So like people that really enjoy compound lifts are really analytical and like having like objective performance improvements. For example, like a machine chest fly is going to be really hard to add a ton of load to over time. So I think that's where kind of using the flexibility of exercise selection can be, used to your advantage. So using things like a feet up bench press instead of, chest flies, using things like a high bar squat instead of leg extensions that make you kind of feel like it's more of like a lift that you can train rather than just hypertrophy work in quotes. I don't think those two are mutually exclusive, obviously, but in terms of a mindset and just kind of psychologically getting through that work with some enjoyment, I think that can help a lot of people in terms of that. So what do you think, Josh?
Yeah, when you were talking there, something that came to mind for me is just like acknowledge the importance of this work. So like I think if you're bought into like, yes, this top set, I know peak intensity, having these heavy exposures is going to be important for my training. Thus I'm psyched up for them. I'm really enjoying this. But if you also acknowledge that, hey, for long term strength gains, uh, this hypertrophy work on leg press or hack squats is also going to be very important for my long term strength gains. Just that little switch can kind of convince yourself to kind of bring some more intent to it, and I think that intent can lead to a more fulfilling training session, if you will. Um, so that's what comes to my mind first, and I definitely echo everything else you said, Zach. Something I think might be of utility to go over is like, okay, let's take the assumption that um, the reason that you're not a big fan of this typical 8 to 12 rep range hypertrophy work because it's just, like you mentioned, Zach, high discomfort that comes with higher repetition work at low RARs. So like basically, how could we roughly equate the hypertrophy stimulus with a little bit less of that discomfort? So that's probably going to lead to heavier loads and lower repetitions per set, and probably lower RPEs as well. So like an example strategy of this would be, okay, instead of sets of 8 to 12 at RP8, let's say you were supposed to do 3 sets of that. You could probably get away with 4 sets of 6 to 8 at that same load you would have used, or slightly heavier and a few RAR further from failure. Would you generally agree with that, Zach?
Yeah, I think so. I'd have to do kind of just some rough math off the top of my head, but just hearing you say that, I think that's pretty safe assumption, especially if you increase the load a little bit.
Hmm.
So long as you're using that kind of 10 RM or heavier, I'm pretty confident that's the case with the limitations in mind that I mentioned.
Yeah. So, and then you also mentioned clusters as a potential option for kind of adjusting the protocol to kind of equate the hypertrophy stimulus. And I think it just depends how you define clusters. So I'm guessing in this case, I know Malik follows our stuff pretty closely, so he probably has a pretty good idea of like what we would propose as clusters. Because in the literature, one research group might call a cluster something totally different than another research group. But in this case, maybe you do like a set of 5 to 7 at like 3 to 5 reps in reserve for your first set. And then you can do a bunch more sets with that same load, but less reps per set. And you're going to end up doing more sets than the initial protocol that you're equating to. But I think that would probably get you similar hypertrophy most of the time. Now, that leads to another discussion of RAR accuracy and just generally staying further from failure does kind of make you prone to accidentally undershooting your kind of that first set to make sure you're in the desired loading range that Zach mentioned. But that is a potential option. It's just kind of like, okay, I'm going to do one set that's like 3 to 4 reps shy of failure. That should be close enough to just kind of get that baseline load, and then I'm going to do like these mini sets after that that are going to be quite far from failure, but they're heavy enough that a rep is kind of a rep for hypertrophy, right? We don't have to push super close to failure for this to be stimulating repetitions. Um, and I think that would be a pretty good recipe to equate the hypertrophy stimulus. Thoughts, Zach?
Yeah, no, I think I definitely agree. I think the only kind of practical nugget to throw in there is that some exercises are definitely going to lend themselves better to doing that than others. Um, the study that always comes to mind for me on this was a study by Zaras and colleagues, and they kind of did something similar to this where they took inter repetition rest. So it was like 4 sets of 6 with 85% of 1RM on the leg press. But the nugget of that study that I found was really interesting is the way that they unloaded the leg press was assisted for the participants. So, like, you know, having to do those cluster sets where you have to unrack and re-rack the weight every time probably is significantly different than doing an exercise where that process isn't as laborious. So like I'm thinking like a chest press is probably easy to do this on. Leg extension probably pretty easy to do this on. Hack squat where you have to like have some axial loading and have to do all of those unracks, especially some of the barbell lifts like squatting, like high bar squats, something like that. It's probably a little bit more uncomfortable, but like you said, uh, um, purely from a theory perspective, I think that would be efficacious. Like as long as the principles that we mentioned are in place of the heavy loading, probably using a maximal concentric intent, um, if not very close to that, and just making sure that the loading range that you're using is accurate and not letting that those faults of RR accuracy that come with higher rep, lower RP sets kind of be a fool's errand for you.
Cool. Sounds good, man. You want to throw the next question out?
Yep, I'll do my best here to summarize. So this question is from a beak. So he kind of has a paragraph here where he kind of, you know what, I'm just going to read it word for word, and then we're going to go from there because I'm going to have trouble summarizing it. So he's kind of giving some context for the programs that he ran, and then asking some questions on how we approach self-programming. So the context that he gives is that I have run a few stock programs over the last 2.5 years and have a little bit of insight into what kind of training and selection of training variables seems to fuel progress, what seems to cause aches and pains, and also what lets him enjoy the process. Specifically, if I start from a template that I feel works for me at this time, what factors do I use to set up a sort of a protocol slash algorithm to decide when to change training variables and tweak them, and how much do I change at a time? As I write this, I realize the amount of change is a vague descriptor given the multitude of training decisions, but I do not know how to frame this question in a better way. Currently, I track estimated 1RM on all the lifts, total volume, and session RP. How long should I wait before reviewing and trying to tweak the current template? Specifically, if the template that I'm following is a 10-week one with 5 weeks marked as developmental and 5 weeks marked as strength, do I review after all the 10 weeks or do I review after each part is over? Or is a 10-week template too long to pre program? Thank you for your time and expertise. Thank you, Abik. Josh, what you got?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think it'll be best to start with the back half of that question, where he was asking like, "Hey, is 10 weeks too long to kind of pre-program?" And then we can dive into more of the specific protocol adjustments, or he calls it an algorithm here for tweaking the different programming variables, and how much should we tweak those programming variables. I think that's a really interesting discussion, but again, let's start with the back half of that question. So, in general, the way I like to frame this is like, if you have a given training cycle, and a training cycle is kind of a vague word, but you can just think of it as like a combination of training blocks, typically 2 to 3 training blocks. So this 10-week program that this individual is talking about sounds like that's one training cycle. And in general, I think you should see a training cycle through unless two things happen. The first of those being a very, very large decrease in enjoyment, right? Like, this is beyond normal ebbs and flows in enjoyment. I think anybody that's been training for more than a few weeks knows that you're not going to be super excited for every single session. I'm talking like you're really second guessing this whole lifting weights thing. That would be a time, okay, it's probably okay to change the training. The second time would be if an acre of pain kind of reaches a threshold where you're like, okay, we should probably make some sort of change here. Beyond that, I think you should more or less see your training cycle through, because that's going to give you the best training data after those 12 weeks, right? If in week 4 you're like, ooh, I'm a 4 out of 10 soreness instead of a 3 out of 10 soreness, I'm going to go ahead and pull back my training volume by 25%. It's like you could do that, and I'm not saying that's a terrible approach, but in general, I'm just not sure how precise we can be with week to week adjustments like that. And then you get to the end of the 10 weeks, you're like, wait, some weeks I was doing 8 sets per week on this muscle group, some weeks I was doing 12 sets per week on this muscle group. I don't really know what this sweet spot is for me. So like, it's just really going to muddy the waters in terms of training data if you're always messing with these variables. And that same concept goes with being 5 weeks into this 10-week program and being like, you know what, I haven't hit my 10 kg PR yet, so it's time to scrap the cycle. Because in that case, it's important to see this cycle through, because it's probably designed to peak you at the end, or set you up for a pretty good lift at the end of the cycle. And B, because you're ending it early, you're not getting good training data, right? 5 weeks worth of training data, that's something, but it's hard to make strong conclusions on. So you're kind of getting a lose-lose situation if you're getting 4 weeks into programs and you're starting to second guess, this entire thing. Like a rule of thumb is just that, hey, if you're only a few weeks into a given training cycle, you probably don't know whether this is a good formula for you quite yet. You're going to need a little bit of time. So that was a long way of saying I think you should see this 10-week program. I think you should see it through, and that's going to give you the best insight um, into what your response is, and of course inform where you go from there. That's not to say that if we're working one-on-one with a client that we just kind of set up a training cycle and say, go for it. I think there's a lot more to it, but in general, again, I think it's really important to see training through. And my observations have been that, people that do this self-programming thing, that does become an issue in the sense that you're always changing things and then you can never actually collect good training data for yourself. I think a really good tactic here is like, oh, I watched this video, or I saw this post, or I listened to this podcast. It's an interesting training idea. I'm tempted to implement it next session, but I'm not going to quite yet. I'm going to have a note in my phone or something, and I'm going to just make a list of potential strategies to implement down the road. I think this is a really interesting idea. It's tempting to implement, but it's the juice isn't going to be worth the squeeze, because then again, like I said, you finish that 10-week cycle, you look back and you're like, oh wait, I changed all these sessions randomly because I had an interesting idea. So that's kind of where I'm at with seeing training cycles through. Zach, I'll pause there, kick it to you. Let me know what you think, and then we can move on to the other part of the question.
Yeah, I think I I think I started thinking about different things than you talked about, so I'm just going to talk about what I was thinking about, and it might be the second half of the question. But the place my head went is just how important it is to have a plan of some kind. Like I think that's the like you said, the main place that people that are self coaching kind of get stuck is that I don't care if it's a 10-week training cycle, a 5-week training block, a longer training cycle, somewhere in between. It doesn't really matter to me. I think there's, you can have advantages and disadvantages for all of those approaches. But to me, the most important thing in the first place is that you have an approach and you're kind of predefining before you start a given training intervention that this is how I'm going to assess this. And I think if you can be honest with yourself and kind of say, okay, what are my preferences and how likely am I to want to like drastically switch things? I think that can kind of lead you to which approach will be a little bit better. And this might be kind of getting to the second half of the question. Um, I think we generally advocate for kind of looking at the training cycle. We can speculate for some reasons why we think that might be a little bit better in terms of like maybe capturing second order effects on average, stuff like that. Periodization being a little bit, more psychologically forgiving in our experience. Again, all of that's just mostly anecdote and driven in our coaching experience. But I think there's just as valid of a case to be made for people kind of looking at this, like you kind of mentioned the 5-week training blocks. I think you could do a very similar thing that we kind of advocate for. And in that example, it would just be see the block through, define, a priori the frame of time that you're going to use as your training unit before you make adjustments, and just do your best to see those through. Except for the circumstances that you mentioned, Josh. So that was the main thing I was kind of thinking about, just how that selection process can be personality and preference driven, and how there's a ton of approaches that can work, but going in with an approach or with a plan, and kind of setting that training unit a priori, I think is a good idea for most people, especially if you're self coaching, because that is, like you said, going to allow you to actually extract training data from every training cycle you run, which if you've been spinning your wheels, that's what you need to do, because you don't know where to go. As you kind of build training cycle upon training cycle, you don't know what changes to make if you're not able to actually extract any consistent information, because you've been constantly changing things within the training unit that you predefined.
Yeah, I think that perfectly leads into the other part of the question, which is what are the factors that I should actually look up, or that I should actually care about, when I'm programming for myself. So like Zach said, kind of a priori okay, how long is this generally going to be? That's not to say you can't be a little bit flexible in the length of it, but are we talking a training block or a training cycle, whatever the case may be? Um, but what is actually driving the outcome here, right? What should I actually, okay, at the end of this 10-week cycle, at the end of this 6-week block, whatever, what should I look back on and say, okay, this needs adjusted, or this contributed to my response on my bench press, but this other factor may need adjusted for to try to see a satisfactory response for my squat, right? What how do you go about that? And I think the biggest thing here that I would emphasize is don't get lost in the weeds. So I think a lot of people will start worrying about the minutia of training and think, oh man, changing this 3 count pause bench to a touch and go bench is going to completely change my response to training. Don't get me wrong, you might you might want to make that change at times, and if anybody talks about like gets too nitty gritty with programming, it's probably us. But in general, I think a lot of people get lost in the weeds of, oh, I saw this cool exercise variation, I want to implement it. That's going to totally unlock progress for me. But we would really emphasize focusing on dialing in the big hitters that are probably going to actually contribute to your response in general, right? And luckily we put a lot of time and effort into creating a product for this, and generally speaking, what we the biggest hitters that we try to manipulate for customers using this product is training volume for each squat, bench, and deadlift, peak intensity for each squat, bench, and deadlift, and volume allocation for each squat, bench, and deadlift. And I'll briefly define those. So peak intensity would just be like, how heavy are my top sets? Am I going up to super heavy singles, or am I more hanging out around triples or sets of 5 for top sets for my peak intensity exposures? And then volume allocation would be, how much of my volume am I doing for this lift on the main lift or a close variation versus something that's further removed. So going back to Malik's questions, things like hack squats or leg press. So those are kind of the big hitters. There are some others as well, but again, I would just keep in mind that there are going to be big rocks that you should focus on before you start worrying about the small things. So you can think about the small things, but don't let that override. Okay, I want to make sure my volume is dialed in for squat, bench, deadlift. I want to make sure my general peak intensity ranges are dialed in for squat, bench, deadlift. I want to make sure my volume allocation is dialed in for squat, bench, deadlift. That's what I would really focus on in terms of the factors for individualizing your training over time. Zach, I'll kick it to you, and then we can talk about kind of like what a good magnitude of change is.
Mm. Yeah, I think just from a philosophical perspective, I think it is important to acknowledge that even the nice, clean categories that you created right there are still kind of all dependent on one another, right? Like it's still
Right.
this kind of melting pot of things, which is why, as much as we try to be technicians with making these small modifications, everything, that's why it's so important to see training cycles through, because even if we could be able to kind of manipulate these variables in a fine mathematical way, the way that each individual reacts to an individual in a given change or a magnitude of a change to each individual variable is probably going to be different between people anyway. So I think that's just a further reason why to once you have made a change, or you set a given configuration of the variables, that's why it's so important to try to see that cycle or see that block through with a similar setup, because that's going to allow you to have more data, so that when we do go to make these modifications, we're actually pulling from something that is individualized to you. We actually have context to make this move on each of these variables. When I say we need more volume, well, if you're benching 10 sets a week and I'm benching 20 sets a week, what's a reasonable change for an increase in volume? Probably somewhere around 20% is what we want to aim for in most cases, but that's going to be very different for both of us depending where our actual starting level is. So I think those kind of things start to paint more of a picture that, all these factors are kind of dependent on one another, and further makes a case that, seeing things through is really important to kind of set up these modifications down the line.
Yeah, I think you basically touched on the magnitude of change question as well. I think 20% for training volume is a decent rule of thumb. That is like, I guess you could say, kind of evidence based on, is it
I think it's 1.5 studies.
1.5 studies at Abe?
Yeah, Alve and I can't forget the other one, but Scarpelli.
Yeah. So what it seems to work out well in practice, though. I will say, like, well, that is kind of going through our filter
Right,
before we say that. We're not just like blindly grabbing that, but that is really what we're going off of based on the research is somewhere around 20%. But like Zach said, there are other considerations there, right? Like if you're benching 25 sets a week, 20% is a pretty big change. You might,
right.
right. It's really
Exercise
gonna,
selection matters as well. Like
yep.
proximity to failure, repetition range, like all those things are kind of playing into that as well.
Yeah, so I love how I was just trying to like make it like three discrete categories, and then we're like, wait, well, proximity to failure, this is all gonna,
No, no, but I think it's important to try to do that to some degree because
yeah,
again, it gives you a framework to operate from. If you don't have anything, then
yeah,
like, we talked about this before. Like all models are wrong, but some are useful. Like I think having
hmm,
that framework or that ground to start from allows you to gain the individual data to
yeah,
which we can actually make adjustments going forward. So like yeah, I don't think the classifications that we have are necessarily perfect, but starting with that, then you train, you tell me how you respond to these given variables, and then we can start making different tweaks. It's not like, you have this subjective feedback and there's an algorithmic way to modify training from there.
yeah.
There's probably for you a way to modify that to get the desired result, and something else for somebody else. So I think it's a good place to start from, but that's why we
It,
made the product, man.
yeah, and I was just gonna say that's why we don't claim that just kind of this individualization system we created for this product is bulletproof, and that's why we have additional things that you get when you're subscribed, primarily like having access to us in the Facebook group, because like Zach said, this is a framework, a
Yeah.
general framework to follow cycle to cycle. Okay, X lift progressed well, Y lift progressed okay, Z lift didn't progress very well. I also have this other feedback. Okay, let's focus on the big hitters. But I also kind of have this question.
Mm,
Okay, I can ask that in the Facebook group. I also was curious about how implementing load caps could play into this, because I think that might be kind of contributing to excess fatigue when I get around the midway point of my strength block. Oh, I'll see if Josh and Zach are willing to do a webinar on that topic. So like that, I don't want to make this about the product, but we've put a lot of thought into like
yeah.
how to answer this exact question. So even if you don't sign up for our product, like I think you can still use these concepts for yourself. Is that having a general system and paying attention is huge, and trying to be systematic is huge, is
Yep.
is, is really what it comes down to. Because I know when I first started like learning, when I kind of went through those couple years where I came across Jeff Nippard, and then you start to go into the evidence-based rabbit hole. You're like, oh, this actually exists, this is awesome, there's all these cool people putting out awesome stuff, and you just get all these ideas, and every single week you want to change something related to your training because something really clicks for you. Like that's just it can definitely be a slippery slope, because then 2 years later you're like, i i I don't really know what what works for me. So I
Yeah.
think trying to be as systematic as possible is useful. So
Yeah, I
anyway,
think the last thing I'll say is like I think having this framework too, I think has made me have the ability I feel to like pick up on some secondary variables that I may not have picked up without a system. I know Mike T has talked about that a ton. You said paying attention. Obviously, that's an awesome quote from him that he's said a lot.
not my
Uh,
quote.
yeah, not your quote. Dash Mike T. Um, but yeah, no, I think that's something that is another huge advantage of having a system. There's going to be like little mini things you can start to pick up on that you may not have thought of if you have like a ton of things that you're changing all the time. Like an example I'm thinking of is uh, like a secondary like a hypertrophy variation for like a squat, for example. Like okay, I have a relatively consistent setup of my training week. And when I put a bilateral variation, my second day squat performance is terrible. But when I put a unilateral variation, maybe my second day squat performance is much better. But I get a similar quad feel on the first day. Stuff like that. Like it when you're working from a system where you don't have all these massively changing parts, I feel like you can start to pick up on some of those little things that, the further you get in your kind of training career, probably make more and more of a difference. Uh, so yeah.
So I just kind of had this thought while you're talking. I totally agree with that, and I've I've noticed that a ton working one on one with people is that, and kind of, Zach, you can let me know if this is a silly phrase or not, but like some degree, like constraints are necessary to
Absolutely.
individualize.
That's a perfect way
Like
to say it. Yep.
because if you don't, if you're like everything is flexible, right? Like on the session to session level, on the week to week level, like if if you have no constraints, it's like what like how can you actually pay attention better? And I think that's a great way of thinking about it, Zach. I've never really put
I,
that
th- I
put
and
that
if I can
together. It's like,
shout, I don't want to show the product anymore, but I'm going to shout out the product one more time. One example that really made me think of this was Jackie, his kind of story in the Facebook group this past week. So I believe he's on his second training cycle, and he kind of was talking about some exercise selection stuff, and he mentioned that his quads, like regardless of the exercises he's thrown at it, just have never been sore. And when you take a look at his really heavy lifts, in contrast to many squatters, his knees don't really come back very much. So, he's been through IP, and we've kind of probably manipulated some volume, intensity, some stuff like that. But the structure overall has remained really similar, and his squat hasn't moved that much. And I think his other two lifts have been doing pretty well, but his squat has been a little bit more stubborn. And I think in that example, we were able to kind of identify, like, hey, dude, we've thrown a lot of stuff at your quads here, and your quads aren't getting super sore. Subjectively, don't feel like they're necessarily the limiting factor. So we recommended him changing some stuff up, maybe trying to attack the hip extensors a little bit more for him, and just like stuff like that. I feel like you're not able to pick up on nearly as readily if you're not working from those constraints, like you mentioned, Josh, in which you can kind of look at those slightly more minutia variables after we've went through these main rocks of the volume, the peak intensity, the volume allocation, all that kind of stuff.
yeah, and that's a great example because it's a way to find the exceptions
Yep.
because for most people we're like, dude, that leg press set that was not
Yep.
2 reps in reserve,
Yep.
and Jackie did an awesome job of that. Like
Mm-hmm.
we went back and forth so much talking about like what's the best heel raise height for his
Mm-hmm.
plat squats, and he bought this thing that has an adjustable heel raise
it
height.
was
Like
it was
I
crazy.
I would never go buy that, but like I was like, yeah, man, he listened to what we had to say and he implemented it, and that ultimately leads you to finding where the potential exception is.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. Some degree of constraint, some degree of big rocks to focus on. That can almost help you to elucidate the little things because hey, when I have Spoto bench versus pin bench, that actually seems to make a meaningful difference. The only way I can detect that is if I have some degree of constraints.
Podcast listeners, you're probably getting a sneak peek at Josh's next Instagram post.
That's you, man. All right, you think we've done that one justice?
I believe so.
All right. Number 3 on here is from Kristen. And the question is a little bit shorter than the last one. And it's just, why does including singles in a hypertrophy phase not violate the principle of specificity?
Okay. Yeah. So I think this is a good one because it allows us to kind of expand on what does specificity mean in different contexts. So to me, we need to talk about what a hypertrophy phase is for someone that has physique goals, and a hypertrophy phase is for someone that's a strength athlete, and what that actually means from a goal perspective. For a physique athlete, a hypertrophy phase, which is going to be a vast majority of their training. You might throw in like a resensitization block or something like that if you're really getting complicated, but it's going to be over 90% of their training. The goal of that block is to maximize the amount of muscle that you're putting on, or maximize the signal for the retention of muscle if you're cutting. However, what changes for a strength athlete is that is not exactly what the goal is. The goal is to put on as much muscle on your frame where provide the best stimulus for retention while minimizing the decline of strength skill. That's the additional caveat that a strength athlete has that a physique athlete may not. And so while minimizing that loss of strength skill, we want to kind of maximize the cost benefit analysis there of, you'll probably lose a little bit of strength skill if you're not having as much exposure to heavy loads potentially, and maybe not as much of your back offs are conducive towards strength expression, but still having those exposures to loads over 85% is going to be very important, so that when you do get back to a more strength oriented phase, you can hit the ground running and hopefully really reach that peak end strength faster than if you were just to completely abandon all exposures to heavy weights in hypertrophy phase, like more traditional kind of block periodized models might have suggested in the past. So I think that's where what it ultimately comes down to is the goal of a hypertrophy phase for a strength athlete versus somebody who's purely physique focused is just adding in that additional kind of preamble of while minimizing the loss of strength skill.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Perhaps a similar way to conceptualize it, or just I think just an initial thing to point out is that if you are a strength athlete and you're in a quote unquote hypertrophy phase, that doesn't mean hypertrophy at all costs.
Mm, yep.
That means, hey, we're biasing hypertrophy. The goal is still to be as strong as possible down the road, right? Maybe a predetermined date, or just, hey, generally 5 years down the road, I want to be as strong as possible. Sure, not doing singles, you might eke out a little bit more hypertrophy because you have a little bit more juice for your hypertrophy work. But that's almost never worth it for a strength athlete, at least in my experience. I don't know if you've ever had a different experience, Zach, but having not having some degree of heavy exposures, I've always just found goes pretty terribly. Now, don't get me wrong, we were just talking about individualizing peak intensity. For some people, that's going to be sets of 5 at RP7 as a top set. I actually have one lifter who I've just moved to biweekly top sets. So just every other week implementing a top set when hypertrophy is the goal. So yeah, so it looks like you have something to say, Zach.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is that the caveat there is that this is when kind of all training options are kind of on the table. But let's say, for example, a strength athlete is significantly lacking motivation to train and needs something to be switched up. That's obviously an example that's a little bit different, where, maybe taking out those top sets and just allowing them to kind of do something that's pretty non-specific, which we both have talked about doing with athletes before. I think that's definitely a time in which that could be implemented. So I think that's a little bit different than our kind of like standard answer. If you're talking like just purely on a piece of paper, theoretically optimal, our hypertrophy phases are simply a shift in bias. Like you said, Josh, we're just kind of putting slightly more of the focus, taking a few eggs out of the strength basket, putting it over here in the hypertrophy basket. But it's not like a huge change there. But let's say somebody's motivation is super low. Maybe they're feeling really beat up after a meet. They just want a pretty drastic change. Maybe that's a time where we implement a more standard hypertrophy phase where maybe you're not touching heavy weights nearly as much, decrease the frequency on the competition lifts, close variance, stuff like that. So I think there's a time and place for that as well. But on paper, I would say that would be kind of our answer, is that, again, it's just a shift in bias rather than something that's completely different.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's very. I'm very glad you pointed that out, because that is an exception that I think, I
It's pretty
like it.
frequent.
It's pretty frequent, right?
Yeah.
Like I'd say most of my coaching roster I've been working with for close to, if not more than a year, and like at some point we've had to take, whether it's a 2 week block or a 6 week block. Hey man, I just kind of want to do some bro work for a little bit, and for like our individualized programming lifters, that's something I always keep in my back pocket whenever somebody brings up something related to motivation to train in the Facebook group. Like, hey man, go ahead and for your next cycle, request a hypertrophy program in which you're not really doing those top set exposures, and you can decrease specificity. Yes, when you get back to it, it might be a little rocky for a couple weeks, but again, if the goal is down the road, then go for it. So I think that's a great point to bring up, Zach. But going back to like on paper, most of the time, our general thought process, we are proponents of kind of doing hypertrophy bias training. We are proponents of kind of doing strength bias training, but we should, I don't know, man, we should probably adjust the way we describe these, because people are like, hey, I'm worried that, I'm pretty far in the off season, or I'm pretty deep in the off season, and I'm hesitant to do the strength phase because
Mm,
I want to put on as much muscle mass as possible. I'm like, no, we've designed these to account for that. Like, we think it's that important that you equate the hypertrophy stimulus, or get as close as possible. I'm like, I don't really want to put a number on it, but I know it's helpful from a conceptualization
mhm.
standpoint. Like, the way that we design them, like, I'd say the hypertrophy stimulus is like 95% as good as what you were doing in the hypertrophy phase. Do you disagree with that?
No, I don't think so. What was I gonna say? I'm losing it now. Yeah, no, I don't think I disagree. I think it's communicating that is difficult, um, because we're trying to highlight like the positives of the training phase rather than
Yeah,
the
exactly,
low
exactly.
lights. It's like, well, when I hear
But from the
strength,
athlete's
yeah,
perspective,
right,
you're always
right,
focusing on what you're not getting,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like,
right. It's the
which is nobody's fault, but it's
no,
just
for sure.
interesting psychology. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't really considered that. So yeah, I mean, maybe we'll have to talk about it. It's training cycle A, training cycle B, or block A, block B.
And they just have no idea, like, which general
Yep.
way we're leaning.
No.
Um,
Here's what I was gonna say. Now I remember. Um, the one thing I'd want to highlight too, when we're talking about like implementing top sets and hypertrophy phase, going back to one of our previous guests, Pack, it doesn't have to be much. Like you can have very minimal exposures. I'd even probably say you can do like a single at a, I don't know, 6 to 7 RP once a week, and probably get pretty robust maintenance of strength skill, touching 90%, ish, somewhere around there, like once a week during hypertrophy phase. I think that's going to pay huge dividends, in comparison to somebody who drops all work above 85% for extended period of time, especially if you're going for like a traditional off-season approach where you're doing like maybe 3 blocks back to back to back that are quote unquote hypertrophy, and you haven't touched over 85% that entire time. I would say you're going to be at a significant disadvantage in comparison to somebody who is regularly touching 90%, even if it's just once a week. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind there.
yeah, I think, in general, and who knows, maybe we'll change our mind on this, but we just aren't proponents. Like, when we say hypertrophy block, we're not saying 4x8 and like that's the heaviest exposure, and then you just
Mhm.
linearly drop it. I'm sure some people that have thought it through and have tried both approaches have landed on that, but it's just gets really bumpy when you're like, all right, we want to hit something heavy within the next couple months. Gets tough. So the way I say it to clients is like, I don't want you to ever be uncomfortable hitting something like 90% plus. I want you to basically always be able to show up and hit that with a good degree of confidence. Um, with the exception that you noted of potentially like, hey, I just need a psychological break.
Yep.
Um, but again, and a huge caveat here is that a it doesn't have to be a top single, right?
Yeah,
Like,
that's exactly what I was gonna say. Yep.
it can be, it can, like, I like some athletes, a triple at a 7 can be just a robust strength practice exposure. For others, not so much, right? So it's always a give and a take. But
Yeah, I think
it,
it's oftentimes I find that, especially people that are like pretty, I don't, maybe nervous isn't the right word, but that's the one that's coming to mind. Like nervous or have high anxiety when they're approaching like really heavy weights. I feel like having that second rep, like, so you can hit it for at least one, but then you're having those second, third, fourth, fifth reps to uh, take it for another ride there and like be able to feel everything out. I feel like is a pretty big advantage for some people. So like I'll pretty frequently prescribe doubles and triples, even if you can make theoretical arguments why singles may be better in some cases, but I think for some individuals, again, it's just there's a wide variation of what's going to be best for somebody depending on all the factors that they present. So yeah, definitely does not have to be a single. We have people that do fives all the way up to singles at a 5 RP, singles at a 9 RP. I
mhm,
think we've both had people that have done singles at a 10 RP, especially on
yeah,
bench, a couple times. So I think it just kind of depends on the context. And when we say top set, we're talking heavy exposures broadly.
yeah. Shout out to my client Will, who I think he's only training 4 times a week right now. But no matter how many sessions we're doing based on his time constraints, Like the number of sessions per week we're training is the number of bench exposures he's doing per
Mhm.
week, and also the number of heavy singles or doubles he's doing. And I have like other lifters would just crumble and fall with that, and I'm one of them. So it's just wild, the individual variability and being able to tolerate and benefit from that stuff. Oh, 4 singles at 8 this week, 5 singles at 8 this week for him, no problem. Other lifters,
Yeah.
not a chance.
Yeah, my lifter Dietrich does that as well. Dietrich eats that up like nothing. He's been PRing like crazy recently.
He
So
hit like
yeah,
407, right?
yeah, he just tried 419 the other day, and it was really close. So I'm sure that's coming soon. So,
And he was ready to go the next day, I bet.
oh yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, he's a machine, man. So yeah, no, it's crazy how much that varies.
Cool. Kristen, thank you for the question. Zach, anything else to add? Or are we good to go?
We're good to go, man.
Cool. Thank you for tuning into episode 20 of the podcast. If you have a second and you made it this far, please leave a rating and review on iTunes. That'd be much appreciated. Share it with a friend, share it on social media. That would also be much appreciated. And there's also a link in the description or the information for the podcast to fill out a question for us to answer on a future episode. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.